All right, good morning, everybody. This week we will be going over the presidency, which is in chapter 10 of the textbook. And just to give some context to the order of the political institutions we'll be going over, like I said last week, the Congress was really the most important branch of government in the founders' eyes because remember, we were escaping from a tyrannical Britain, right? And in Britain, they didn't have a Congress and a presidency separate. We have a parliamentary system in which the Congress and the presidency are in the same body. There's no separation of powers. There's no checks and balances. So the beauty of the American Congress is that it is a separate institution that is really made up of direct representation. Right? In other words, if you live in a particular area, you have a representative in Congress that you vote for personally, with uh, a representative, which is sort of the whole beautiful thing of having a representative democracy, right, with checks and balances, right? And so Congress was created as the first institution of government following the presidency, Article 2, right? And why it's so important for there to be checks and balances and separation of powers is so one institution of government doesn't accumulate too much power on their own, right? And so let's say Congress passes a bill that the president doesn't deem fit to be for the interest of the people of the country, right? He has a power. He can veto that law, right? And Mr. Trump has exercised that right many times, right? And so has Barack Obama, right? When the House Republicans under President Obama voted 63 times to repeal Obamacare, right? And let's say the Senate did the same thing as well. President Obama vetoed that law because he believed that Obamacare was essential, and repealing it would be detrimental to the people of the country, right? And so there's that balance between the presidency and Congress that we have in the American representative democracy we live in, that the British people don't have in their direct democracy. And so I hope that I'm reading through your discussion forum posts. I hope that you're really able to see with the two Washington Post articles that I assigned that the evolution of Congress is a real thing. It's happening before our eyes, and how it's different from the founding. What would the founders think about it? Would they be rolling over in their graves to see how Congress is acting today? And what impact does it have on our system of government? Right? In other words, this is an institution of government that has a lower approval rating than the presidency, right? We currently live in a country with three branches of government, where we have the Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court, right? And the Supreme Court is the only institution where the folks on there are not elected or voted in, and they have the highest approval rating, right? I think if you look at an approval, a public opinion poll from September of 2019, they have a 57% approval rating, while Congress and the presidency are in the low 20s, right? It's weird. It's unusual, and yet that's where we're at in 2019 and 2020. So today we're going over the presidency, chapter 10. The presidency is established by Article 2 of the Constitution, right? And it says, the executive power shall be vested in a president, right? In other words, the founders didn't want there to be a multi-person council, right? Some countries, they have an executive council. Right? In other words, there's not just one president, but there might be a council. And if they want to pass something, it has to pass a majority of the folks on the council, right? The framers rejected that. They didn't want that, right? And it's really in the vesting clause of Article 2 of the Constitution where it is clear that they reject a multi-person executive, right? as it says, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. That's one person, right? And why they really wanted that was because they wanted the presidency to have the energy they need, right? So far up to now, it's been a he, right? And looking at how the primaries are looking, it's going to be a he again, unfortunately, right? But the founders really wanted the president as one person who would have the energy necessary to lead the country during times of crisis, right? And a common theme of this chapter will be presidents expand their power in times of need, right? I wish we were in class in person because I like to do, these hand gestures. Not quite as, I don't use them as much as Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, right? But when I talk about expanding power and restricting power, I like to use my hands like this, right? Because the vesting clause really ensures, this is important to recognize, that the president has the power necessary to rule and make decisions in times of emergency, war times, right? Mr. Trump this week has said that we are in a war against this virus, and this coronavirus is quote unquote the invisible enemy, right? And he's right, and it gives him that power and flexibility to rule in times of need, right? So the vesting clause is very important to recognize for the American presidency, right? Two more clauses I would like you to know in the presidency: the take care clause and the commander-in-chief clause, right? The take care clause ensures that, quote, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. All that means, it's sort of a doubling down of the vesting clause, right? The vesting clause ensures that, okay, the presidency is one individual who has the power they need to rule in times of trouble, wartime, right? The take care clause is a doubling down because it ensures that the president will do whatever he needs to do possible to ensure that the laws that Congress passes are executed faithfully. Right? In other words, that the laws are being enforced as they were written, right? And so, whatever way you look at it, the take care clause ensures that the president has the power he needs to enforce the laws that Congress passes. And it's just another way of establishing a potentially strong president, right? So if you think about our conversation last week, right, the Congress was the strongest branch of government in the founders' eyes. In other words, the people directly elected their members of Congress to represent them, and the founders wanted that to be significant and acknowledge how different that was from the British system, right? And that the president was implemented as a one-person leader to lead the country and to hold checks on that Congress, right? But you cannot ignore these three clauses in the presidency, in the second article, that ensure that the president has power when he needs it, right? So you have the vesting clause, the take care clause, and you have the commander-in-chief clause. Okay? The commander-in-chief clause says that the president of the United States is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States, right? And so, again, Congress has the power to declare war, right? Article 1, but the president is the commander-in-chief. What's up with this friction, right? And so one of the articles that you're reading for this week is called "The War Over the War Powers," and it's by the chair of my dissertation committee. And his argument is essentially that there's a difference in the term declare war and make war, right? One of the major points he makes in this article is that at the Constitutional Convention, the founders changed the phrase in Article 1 from make war to declare war. And his argument is that when you declare war, you're not actually boots on the ground. You're not actually in charge of physical or a military conflict, right? His explanation for declare war is that as a Congress, you have to inform your constituents. You have to inform the American people that we have gone to war, or we are not at a state of peace in this country anymore. And that really the president, with the commander-in-chief clause, is given most of the power to execute or maneuver military conflicts abroad. Do you agree with that? I have difficulty with that. I see his argument, right? But it's a debate that you can have with yourselves when you read this article and when you post in the discussion forums, right? That the Congress is given the commander the power to declare war, but the president is the commander-in-chief. What is up with this conflict, right? Okay. More express powers written in Article 2. The president makes treaties with consent of the Senate, right? Checks and balances. Thank you, checks and balances. Grant pardons. Nominate judges and other public officials. Thank you, checks and balances, right? We need the Senate to approve those appointments. Receive ambassadors and command the military. That's one of his major powers as president. So I'm going to go through a few of the main presidential powers and talk about how there's a lot of conflict with how the founders laid out these powers, right? He's the commander-in-chief. He's the head of the nation's intelligence networks, CIA, NSC, NSA, the FBI, right? The president can deploy troops domestically during emergencies, right? You're seeing right now, I think in California and New York especially, that the president has deployed the National Guard and other military forces to help assist in the efforts to deal with the coronavirus, right? What about overseas? Can the president do that? Clearly, we've been playing cops and robbers for 240 years, essentially, right? So wait a second, right? And that's why I love this GIF on the bottom of the screen here. Isn't Congress given the power to declare war, right? In the Constitution, the founders put an article. I'm trying to find my pocket Constitution. I can't find it because all the cool kids keep it on them. Right? But the founders put that Article 1, the Congress is given the power to declare war, right? And yet the president is the commander-in-chief. And if you're a scholar like Dr. Bassett, he believes that, the declare war doesn't mean boots on the ground. It just means that Congress informs the American people that we are not at a state of peace, right? So that's military power. Judicial power. Pardons, reprieves, and amnesty, right? President Ford famously pardoned Richard Nixon after the whole Watergate scandal, right? President Carter declared amnesty for draft evaders for the Vietnam War. Reprieves are when you delay someone's criminal sentence, and you don't hear about that many reprieves. Now, that's a presidential power, right? And so the president should be able to pardon without congressional approval, right? This is in Federalist number 75. It's a constitutional argument. I have an argument here, and I put it on the PowerPoint, right? Partisanship might get in the way, right? In other words, if you're president of the United States, you might want to conduct pardons that will help you politically, right? And so the pardon power could be misused for political purposes, right? And I put that whom in as obviously it's been used for political purposes, right? Who did President Trump pardon in 2017 from Arizona? Sheriff Joe Arpaio, right? He defied the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court told him, stop, tell your police force to stop pulling people over based on racial profiling, asking for their paperwork. That is unconstitutional. Right? And he was trying to do this to clamp down on illegal immigration, right? And he was convicted of that. He defied the Supreme Court. He just kept doing it. And Mr. Trump pardoned him in 2017. Basically, good job, right? And that's the president's power. He can do that. But this anti-federalist argument that I propose is If a pardon is misused for political purposes, is that dangerous? It's not necessarily unconstitutional, but is it dangerous politically? And that's something really to think about. Diplomatic power, right? As head of state, you make treaties, you forge executive agreements, right? And with Barack Obama and the Iran deal, it was an executive agreement because it's a contract between two nations. It's similar to a treaty, but doesn't require Senate approval, right? That's sort of the loophole here, right? And so just as easily as Obama signed the Iran deal, Trump withdrew from it immediately when he became president because it's not binding. It didn't need Senate approval, right? And excuse me. And so is that a problem? Is that a problem that the president of the United States has this power as head of state to conduct diplomatic relations, and yet if you get out of office, your successor can just rip up the whole thing? That's a bit problematic to me. I love this. This is the sort of famous clapback that Nancy Pelosi gave to President Trump at last year's State of the Union. Every president has to give a State of the Union. It helps initiate legislative action. It's where the president lays out his plan for the upcoming year, right? And so obviously, when Democrats took back the House in 2018, there is still to this day continues to be friction between House Democrats and the president because obviously due to their political differences, right? But they have to work together. If they want to pass anything, you have to work together. And so this famous clapback comes because Nancy Pelosi is not a fan of anything the president really has to say. And so this was her moment on national TV to really express that in a somewhat respectful way, right? So the president has to give a State of the Union. He can veto bills. It's a constitutional check that he has on the Congress. He has the power to issue executive orders, right? It's a rule issued by the president that has the effect and formal status of legislation, but can be revoked by the next president because it's not binding, right? Delegated powers, right? I love this GIF too. Congress often, and that's pretty inaccurate. It's not often. It's Congress delegates many powers to the presidency. Congress cannot execute and administer all the programs it creates and all the laws it enacts. Remember at the beginning of the semester where I asked you, what are some political issues that are important to you, right? And the main takeaway message from that little exercise or icebreaker we did was, a lot of these things aren't in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that lays out the things that, the responsibilities that Congress has, right? And of course, that's clearly obvious, right? Because the country was different in 1787. Civil society was just different in 1787. Right? A lot of the things we worry about today, we don't work. They didn't even think about back then, right? And so why Congress delegates power to the presidency is because they just don't have enough brain power in Congress to administer and look after all these different programs, all these different policies that some of you thought of and we put on the board, right? So here are four major things that Congress has really just given to the president to go over, right? Education. The Department of Education deals with all school funding in this country, right? HHS, Health and Human Services, overlooks Medicare and Medicaid funding. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, looks after community development, and the Department of Labor looks after job training, right? And who leads all these agencies? The president's people, right? The president appoints who he wants to lead these agencies, and they have to be approved by the Senate. And so why I love this GIF, it's because the founders originally didn't have this idea of bureaucracy. right? And that's the next chapter that we'll be going into, because bureaucracy isn't Article 3. It is not a branch of government, and yet it's sort of taken over as a branch of government. These are powers that Congress should have. Congress is the branch of government that should be creating public policy. And we've given these responsibilities to the president, where these executive agencies have sort of exploded. There's thousands, if not tens of thousands, of employees that work in these executive agencies that look after school funding, Medicare, community development, job training, right? And so this delegation of power from Congress to the presidency is problematic constitutionally, because it's caused the presidency to balloon. The executive branch of government has really gained mass, has gotten bigger over time. And so contemporary bases of political power, presidential power, and this is one of the discussion questions, right? Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. During the 19th century, Congress was the nation's dominant institution of government, right? Obviously not true today, right? Except there were two major presidents in the 19th century that changed the presidency, right? They're Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, right? Andrew Jackson was a populist, right? And I think Mr. Trump likes that about Mr. Jackson, because he has this, it's a painting or a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, which is a little unusual considering what he has done. But regardless, he really changed the nature of presidential campaigns, right? The populist rhetoric, the fact that personality matters more than experience and past experience and policy proposals, right? As president, he vetoed 12 acts of Congress, more than anyone ever before him combined, right? And okay, you're thinking, well, that's a constitutional power, isn't it? Well, it is. The veto is constitutional power that the president has. But what's notable about Andrew Jackson was they were not constitutionally grounded vetoes, but they were policy grounded. In other words, he used the veto power to eliminate policies he didn't like, right? So usually, think about it. The Congress passes a law that you advocate for and most Americans want, right? And if the president vetoes it, that's a big letdown. That's a big disappointment. You want to know why. What was unconstitutional about this law? And so the fact that in an era, in a century where presidents were weak, this president vetoed 12 acts of Congress, not on constitutional grounds, but on policy grounds, that was big. That was huge. It changed the nature of the presidency moving forward, right? Abraham Lincoln, right? Again, a major theme of this chapter is presidents gain power and momentum when there's emergency, right? And obviously, the Civil War was, one of the country's biggest wars, right? 600,000 people died. I think that would approximately be 6 million people today, right? If you inflate for populations, right? So he was a wartime president. And he exercised a lot of executive power, right? He blockaded southern ports. He suspended habeas corpus. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves without congressional approval, right? So if you were, a racist guy in the South with slaves, you were thinking, WTF? How can this guy just sign a piece of paper and free all these slaves, right? He exercised executive power in a time of emergency. The presidency grew under times of emergency. And the rationale was emergency conditions. So from Abraham Lincoln going forward, it was clear, right, that emergencies could give the president more executive power and rationale to rule in such a way, right? And there are three main ways presidents expand their power. One, they go to the public, right? And there's this theory called going public. We also it's called the rhetorical presidency, which is this next article that you have for today. It's called A Post-Rhetorical Presidency, and it looks at Obama's presidency. As technology improved over time, presidents were able to just go public. They didn't have to go through Congress to get their message to the American people. They could just, go on the radio, like FDR did with his fireside chats, go on television, like JFK and Ronald Reagan did. They can go on Twitter, like Barack Obama and Mr. Trump. They could go have campaign rallies, like Mr. Trump does, right? These are all ways to garner popular opinion by the President of the United States just going directly to the people. And that's a new method. It's not in the Constitution. It's sort of outside the constitutional means of presidential communication, right? Control of executive agencies or the creation of new administrative institutions and procedures. Like I mentioned a few slides back with, Department of Health, Human and Health Services, Education, Labor, and those executive agencies. The president has full control over those agencies. He can do whatever he wants with them. And so if he wants to expand them by increasing their powers or adding more people, he can do that. Right? If he wants to decrease it, he can do that as well. Probably won't do that though. And number 3, we rely on their political party in Congress to implement their legislative agenda. Right? This is hard to do when your party is in the minority in Congress, but you can see very well, right, with this president and this Congress, especially the Senate, how much in tune they are. Right? Mitch McConnell, who is the Senate Majority Leader, has many times said he will not vote on a bill if the president doesn't express support for the bill, right? And it's like, really, bruh, what are you doing? Right? You are a separate institution of government. You are not in cahoots with the presidency, right? You put the bill on the floor if you think the American people will support it, not if you think the president will support it, right? And so this president, as many presidents have in the past, really rely on their political power in Congress to get things done, to get things passed, right? And so with the increased partisanship in Congress, you have a legislative leader like Mitch McConnell really depend on the president. A little too much, right? I just went over this, right? Popular mobilization is key to going public, right? FDR used for fireside chats. He used the radio for that. He would send messages to the American public through his radio his radio talks, right? President Obama was the internet president, right? The White House website, kept people informed of what the president was up to. He appeared on podcasts. He used Facebook and Twitter, right? But definitely Trump's Twitter use has put any president's Twitter use on steroids, or any politician's Twitter use on steroids, by always constantly communicating with not only his supporters, but with the whole country. Because once the president tweets something, all major media outlets will cover it. And, whether you want to think about Mr. Trump or not, you're thinking about him. Someone in your social network has brought his name up, or something he tweeted, probably within the last, I would say, few days. Right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Trump's rallies too. Very interesting from a political science perspective. The impact that Trump's rallies have on public opinion, on getting things passed in Congress. What are the relationship between those things? We don't really know yet. There's not much research out there on that. But his campaign rallies are really spectacular to watch from a political science perspective. There are limits to going public, though, right? Popular support is not a firm foundation for presidential power. Right? In other words, I think if you look before 2018, where Mr. Trump lost, or the Republicans lost the House, right? His approval rating wasn't really different. His approval rating has been somewhat stable throughout his whole presidency. He had campaign rallies, support was there, right? And yet he lost about 40 seats in the House, which is amazing from a political science perspective, right? So just popular support isn't really stable enough to ensure that you maintain that presidential power. Public opinion is fickle, right? Human beings are interesting creatures. Anything can really change our mind at on notice like that, right? Overall, public approval declines during a president's term. Again, from a political science perspective, it is amazing how from the beginning of Trump's presidency to currently, it hasn't really wavered, right? But if you look at most presidents, they start up high and they gradually get lower over their term. And presidential performance rarely meets expectations because when you're on the campaign trail, you're always trying to promise you that I'm going to kiss your baby, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You can't get everything done. It is just impossible to accomplish everything that you want. Right? There are limits to presidential power. The framers were concerned that executive power could be abused and thus stifle liberty. Right? So there are checks and balances that the founders put in place. There's a 4-year term limit, right? And until FDR, there weren't term limits, right? FDR had 4 terms in office. And after FDR passed away while he was in office, Congress thought, okay, we should probably put a term limit on the number of terms that presidents have in office. And so there was a constitutional amendment to limit that to 2 terms, right? So that's a definite check, 2 terms in office. Congress can impeach and remove the president from office. We saw that last year, right? That feels like a million years ago, but Congress impeached the president last year. The House of Representatives impeached the president. The Senate did not remove the president, right? Congress can reject presidential appointments. Congress can deny funding for presidential programs. If you remember, almost 2 years ago, we had that whole government shutdown thing where the House would not give Mr. Trump the $5 billion he wanted for the border wall. He stuck to the $1.8 billion, right? That's a check that Congress has on the president. Congress can also override presidential vetoes, but you need 2/3 of Congress to do that. That's a hard thing to do. Okay. I put this slide in here. It's a theory of the presidency I learned in graduate school. You don't have to know too much about this. I would like you to be able to cite Greenstein, maybe in a discussion forum post. I would definitely give you brownie points with me. But basically, to sum it up pretty easily, Greenstein says that there is a modern president, right? In other words, that the presidency today is very different from what it was during the founding era. And there are 4 factors that make that up, right? 1, the president is a legislative leader. He's actively involved in setting up the legislative agenda in Congress, right? Remember, that's not what the founders wanted, right? The founders did not want the president to be a legislative leader. The founders wanted leaders in Congress to be legislative leaders. They're 2 separate branches of government, right? And now they're sort of colluding with one another to get things passed, right? That's not what the founders wanted, right? Because they wanted there to be accountability, flexibility, but accountability in each branch of government, right? Unilateral power, actively made policy through executive orders and other actions not ratified by Congress, right? Whenever a president signs an executive order or does an executive agreement, you're not consulting Congress. You're effectively enacting law without letting Congress know, right? The founders would be rolling around in their grave if they knew that this was actively being used, right? Administration, a rise in presidential bureaucracy, right? a large increase in the White House staff, right? Just the bureaucratization of government has made government very different than what the founders envisioned, right? And the personal presidency, which I think is actually beneficial, right? Because with social media, with how closely connected we are to one another, it's nice to see what the presidency is the president is like as a person. Right? Presidents as symbols of heroic qualities, which can be the most effective benefactor, as well as a scapegoat and for social and political discontent. Right? The fact that the president has feelings, the president has empathy, or the president doesn't have empathy, or the president's an asshole, or, excuse my French, or the president is charitable, right? These are all things that we would like to know who the leader of our country is. And so these four factors, these 4 bullet points really make up Greenstein's theory of how different the presidency is today than it was during the founding. So this slide is really important for your discussion forum, right? Stick to this slide for a bit. The modern presidency says that those 4 factors I just went over started with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? The rhetorical presidency is a theory. You have to read this article. There's a few paragraphs, 1, 2, on what this theory is, right? This is a required reading, so you should know what the rhetorical presidency is. He argues that it starts with Toulouse, right? And the post-rhetorical presidency is what this guy, picture of him. Thought there was a picture of him on here, but Justin Vaughn, he teaches at Idaho State, Boise State. Right? He comes up with this theory. It's not a real scholarly theory, but it's something I want you guys to think about. This article. That's the post-rhetorical presidency, and then the constitutional presidency, Bissett and Yu, right? They believe that the president has expansive war powers, but he's always had them, going back to George Washington. So their argument is essentially, for Bissett's article, The War Over War Powers, is that the president has always been strong. Go back to George Washington and look at what he did. He led his troops into battle at the Whiskey Rebellion, right? So there are different theories of the presidency, and I want you to really be able to think about each one briefly. This is not a presidency course. If you can't tell, this is my favorite chapter to go over, because this is my specialty. But I want you to be able to think about each theory of the presidency and in ways to inform the public today of how has the presidency changed over time, or has it? Has the presidency changed over time, right? Okay, so briefly, right, because you are responsible for these articles. Here are just a few points from each of the articles. So the Bissett article is the war over the war powers, and this is straight out of the first page. Biden rightly observed, this is Joe Biden running for president, that many constitutional scholars hold that Congress must authorize most, if not all, significant military actions by the United States abroad. Yu, on the other hand, John Yu, who this is a book review of, maintains that the president has full constitutional authority to enact initially, and that Congress, after the fact, can check the president's folly by denying the president the means to conduct war, and in extreme cases, impeach and remove him from office. Right? Congress doesn't need to formally authorize military commitments abroad, for which the president possesses ample constitutional authority. So this just gives you a sense that Bissett and Yu have this notion that the presidency can initiate all military conflicts abroad, right? And that Congress should be notified afterwards. And if Congress is not happy, they could cut the money or impeach and remove him from office, right? That those are the checks that Congress has on the president, right? This is an argument of the presidency. you can agree or not, right? This is a pretty controversial argument, right? You could be with Bissett and you, or you could be with Joe Biden and other constitutional scholars that say that Congress has the right to declare war, not the president, right? So I would read, you have to read the article, it's required, but it's an interesting read. Right? The post-rhetorical presidency of Obama basically argues that public opinion plus presidential persuasion leads to public policy. Meh. What meh symbolizes is that that doesn't always work, and it hasn't worked in a long time, right? So the classical theory of the rhetorical presidency is that Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson went directly to the people. They went directly to the people with their appeals, with their political agenda, right? And that this was a seismic shift from passive presidents that dealt with Congress to active presidents that went directly to you, the American people. Right. And this transition was easier through developing technology, right? And so Justin Vaughn comes up with this theory saying, public opinion and presidential persuasion does not lead to public policy. Look at Obama. And the unfortunate cycle is, so Vaughn talks about Obama and gun control, right? So that he says there's a tragic event. It leads to a somber statement. It leads to a call for gun-related reform. Then there's gnashing and wailing from those demanding reform when it again fails to materialize. And then there's a gradual decline in salience. In other words, we kind of forget about it. There hasn't been a shooting in a while, so we forget about how important this issue is. And then it happens again. And so this unfortunate cycle is what Vaughn calls the post-rhetorical presidency. And he uses Obama and gun control as his major case study. And his solution, a possible solution, is that unilateral action could be successful. And I say that with a question mark because does that go against checks and balances and Congress being the body of government to initiate public policy? Maybe something like that has to be done, because with gun control, this has been a major issue for years and nothing has been done, right? And so that's all I have for today. I know I went over a lot, right? But we went over the institution of the presidency, how it sort of evolved over time. The different theories of the presidency really highlight that, and so do these readings. And so with that, please, once you're done with this lecture, watching this lecture, looking at my face, talking about the presidency, read these 2 articles on the presidency, answer the discussion questions in the discussion forum, and have that done by Thursday. Reply to 2 or Wednesday or Thursday, depending on when your due date is, and have your 2 peer reviews or peer responses by the end of the week. And with that, have a good day, be safe, and thanks for listening.